Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome each of you to this exciting event. My name is Hwan-Soo Kim, and I teach Korean religion and culture in the Department of Religious Studies. Today's gathering will be exploring an issue surrounding national and cultural identity and their origins. At the heart of our discussions lie these questions. What defines Korea? Who are the Koreans? And what constitutes the essence of what can be called Korean identity, whether political, ethnic, national, even linguistic? While these queries may initially appear straightforward, upon close examination, they reveal themselves to be very intricate and challenging to articulate. Recently, the historical relationship between Korea and China has been a subject of scholarly debate, especially with the rise of China as a global power and Korea's emergence on the global stage. Was Korea an offshoot of China proper? Or did it stand on distinctive footing with its neighbor in ancient times, even throughout history? And is there an alternative interpretive framework that can offer fresh perspectives on this matter? Today, we are privileged to have two distinguished historians with us. Each of them has dedicated their careers to grappling with these very questions in their research. One of our speakers is a leading historian who has delved into historical records spanning China, Japan, and Korea. The other is an archaeologist whose primary focus lies in uncovering insights from archaeological remains in East Asia and Eurasia. Despite their differing methodologies, both scholars share a commitment to a transnational and multidisciplinary approach in their pursuit of tackling these aforementioned questions, which is evident in the titles of their talks today. We are indeed fortunate that they have kindly agreed to engage in a constructive dialogue with each other and with all of us gathered here today. So now please allow me to introduce our speakers briefly. Stella Xu holds the John Turveyfield Endowed Chair and serves as a professor of history at Roanoke College in Virginia. Her extensive research encompasses various facets of East Asian history, including the complex interplay of Korean-Chinese relations, nationalism in East Asia, and contemporary historical disputes. Professor Xu is the author of an acclaimed book entitled Reconstructing Ancient Korean History, The Formation of Koreanness in the Shadow of History, published in 2016, and has contributed numerous articles to this field of study. Inu Kang is a scholar of Northeast Asia and Eurasian archaeology, particularly focusing on the Bronze and early Iron Age. With degrees MA and BA from Seoul National University and his PhD from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology at the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Dr. Kang currently serves as a professor in the Department of History at Kyunghee University in Korea. His scholarly endeavors have resulted in several monographs, including ones entitled Exploring the History of Eurasia, The Nomads of the Eurasian Steppe, A Journey into Altaic Plains, Dancing Pade People, and co-authored works, as well as many articles, some of which written in English. So we have structured today's event in the following order. So Professor Xu will give the first presentation for 25 minutes, followed by Professor Kang for the same amount of time. To maintain our schedule, we're going to make sure to give them a gentle reminder when they have 5 minutes remaining, and then 2 minutes. In Jung will pretty much put up the sign in case they don't finish on time. This event has been made available by the generous support of the Dr. Hongnam Kim Korean Studies Fund. And also I would like to thank our council staff, especially Assistant Program Director In Jun Kim, for ensuring the success of this event. Without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Professor Stella Xu.
Good afternoon. I'm very honored to be here, and I thank Dr. Hwan-Soo Kim to invite me here, and I thank all the kind staff members from Council on East Asian Studies to make this wonderful event possible. I came here yesterday, and I was deeply impressed by Yale University for many things, but maybe many of you, it's your first time to hear Ronald College. Where is it, and what is that college? I can proudly tell you, I mean, Yale as R1 prestigious university and the Ronald College as a small liberal arts college in Southwest Virginia, there is at least one in common. That's the embracing of international students, diversity, and also different cultures. When I started at Ronald College, I have no idea what it, just like many of you. And so I was very impressed. Believe it or not, Ronald College is one of the first US colleges to host first generation Korean students studied in the United States. So from 1890s, that's the beginning time. From 1890s to 1930s, Ronald College had 34 Korean students. At that time, we called Joseon, right? Joseon students studied at Ronald College. And that's actually the majority of the whole first generation of Korean students studied at Ronald College. So when I visited the admission office of the Yale, and I can see that Yale even included the Yongwing's story into the main chronology of Yale University. That deeply, deeply touched me and impressed me as well. So now at least you know that there's one thing in common of Ronald College with Yale University. So thank you all very much for making your time coming here. So today I am going to talk about, speaking of my book, it's this book, and it was published in 2016. And then we have no time to talk too much out of my book, so I'm going to focus on the first chapter of my book. So the first chapter, I'm going to focus on three different points. So first of all, I want to discuss about the formation of Chinese views on the others. And then second, what's the perception of the others, non-Chinese people, impact the Chinese foreign policy? And the last part I'm going to discuss, actually Chineseness and Koreanness, the formation, the evolution of them, they were actually interconnected and interdependent as well. So let's see how it goes. At the beginning, I mean, we study about historical documents, and the people are thinking of, what's the beginning of, let's say, a term, a concept of Chinese used to name non-Chinese people. That was actually Yi. So according to a Han Dynasty scholar, philologist, Xu Shen, he argued that Yi actually coming from, combining two characters together. Indeed, if you put Da and then Gong inside, it becomes Yi. So he argued that the reason they use this Yi to refer non-Chinese people, obviously, most of the non-Chinese people at that time, they were pretty good at, pretty good at archery. So Da is big, Gong is the arrow. So the people who can use big arrow well. So that's the beginning of the Yi. However, if you look at the oracle bones, so I believe all of us know that the oracle bone is the beginning of the Chinese writing. And if you look at those oracle bones, and then there are three characters. They looked very similar, and they were often used interchangeably. So there is Ren, that's human, people, and there is Yi as the non-Chinese barbarians, and then Fang as the direction. And as you can tell from the image, they were actually pretty close to each other, and also indeed, in many ways, they were used interchangeably. This is the overall development of the Chinese concept of non-Chinese others. So from the oracle bones, you have this Yi and the Ren people and the Fang, and you just remembered from the previous slides that the shape of the characters, it looked pretty close. And from the Zhou Dynasty bronze inscriptions, they start to use Yi more exclusively. So it's the Yi that refer to non-Chinese people. And then they also had start to have a modifier to modify those non-Chinese people. However, it's from the C and the D. From C, it's the following spring, autumn, and the warring states period. And you can quickly tell there are a cluster of different names, right? So there are more non-Chinese peoples, and then they start to create more different terms to name them. One thing you probably have found out if you learned a little bit of Chinese cultures, all those names somehow related to have an animal radical. That's how Chinese sort of discriminating other people. So they often use somehow animal-related characters to name non-Chinese people. So the D part, Han Dynasty part, that is the most critical part that I would say that's the fundamental period of the formation of Chinese versus non-Chinese. And then you see two changes there. So one, of course, you see more names, very specific names. But at the same time, you also see the directions. So because at that time, yes, indeed, China started to have a deeper understanding of different people, but at the same time, they still do not know enough. So they often just use the direction east, west, south, north to name them. So this is the overall formation of the Chinese views on the others. This is a map from a 1997 book. It's called 华夏边缘, The Frontier of the Chinese. So as you can tell, at that time, China was kind of really small. Yes, China started from really small, and then China was surrounded by all different type of frontier ethnic non-Chinese people. So to the north, there's Xianbei, there's Xiongnu. Xiongnu is the people we are going to focus on. And then to the northeast, there is Chaoxian, another focus. And then to the southernmost, we will have Nanman and Nanyue. That's the southern Yue, and that's another focus of our talk today. Then you would think Yi, that means the non-Chinese people. And then it may start to have some kind of derogatory and discriminating meaning already. However, we have a good evidence of, at the beginning, Yi probably means more about people. Different people, and much less about discrimination, much less about this kind of derogatory kind of meaning. So why do I say that? So the first quote is from Mengzi, Mencius, and everybody knows Mencius. He was highly revered as the ancestor of Chinese culture or Chinese people as well. So have a brief translation of that. Basically says that even the Shun was the people from Eastern barbarian land, if you want to translate Yi as a barbarian land. And then King Wen of the Zhou Dynasty, he was from the Western barbarian land. So we know both the Shun and then King Wen of the Zhou, they were the highly revered Chinese ancestor, but they still, in Mengzi, he still used the Dongyi or Xiyi to name them. So here we can have evidence that it's more of telling about the people from Eastern region, Western region, and it's less about telling them they are primitive or they are barbarians. Another thing that is also very interesting, so this actually was quoted very often for the following period. That's about Confucius. Confucius mentions about his views about Dongyi. So Confucius actually lamented of his time that there is no sage king, but he referred that in the eastern land there are sage king, and he wanted to live there. And then his disciples asked him that, oh, the eastern barbarian land, they were primitive, they were vulgar, why do you want to go live there? There is even no ritual things over there. And then Kongzi replied that if the gentleman lived there, then how can you say that's a primitive land? So this quote actually was used very often when people wanted to give cultural credits about Dongyi. So that's another example. This is from the 后汉书, and at the very end it says that 孔子寓居九夷. So even 孔子wanted to live in the eastern barbarian land. So the blue part, 所谓中国诗里求之四夷者也. So when in China there is lack of the ritual propriety, you are going to seek them in eastern barbarian land. So when China was in chaos, they tried to imagine a sort of like a lost paradise. And then in this case, they believe the eastern land is the lost paradise, and then there are still people, the gentlemen still live there, sage king live there, and also that's also the place that you can look for the ritual propriety when China no longer has it. So these all says that when China was in a difficult time, they tried to imagine the eastern barbarian land as not a land of primitive culture, but a land of remaining carrier of Confucian tradition. So these are the books, that primary sources that I mostly use. And then I use like 4 major books. It's first one is 史记, second is 汉书, third one is 三国志, the fourth one is 后汉书. However, you can tell for the first 2, when they refer to the ancestor of Koreans, they use the Chaoxian chapter. So for these dynastic standard records, and then they start to have a tradition. Actually, it started from Sima Qian. They have this tradition that they allocated special chapters for non-Chinese people, and then at that time they used Chaoxian. However, for the number 3 and number 4, 三国志 and 后汉书, there is a huge difference right there. So for the early ancestor of the Koreans, they made a separate Dongyi chapter, Eastern Barbarian chapter. So the early Korean ancestors, they were recorded in that section. So that's a huge difference. So we will talk with a little more details about the difference. So we talked about the formation of the non-Chinese people. And then we want to think about then how does that have any impact on Han-Chinese foreign policy? I would say it's decisive. It's a very critical way to think about when Han Dynasty decide to make a decision of, here are these people, how do we deal with them? So their perceptions and really decide how they want to treat them and how they want to negotiate or do with them. So of the Han period, I emphasize that there are 3 different major frontier or ethnic groups. So the first one is the Xiongnu, and second one is the Nanyue, the third one is Chaoxian. So I want to use how the Chinese perceptions of these people really had decided how they want to deal with these people. So for the Xiongnu, I would say Han Dynasty really tried to use the military resolution. And for the Nanyue, they used the assimilation policy. For the Chaoxian, I think it's a very unique case. Chaoxian was very successful that on the one hand, they have to provide this kind of nominal submission to the Chinese dynasty in most cases. At the same time, they maintained their virtual autonomy. So they were a successful so-called semi-peripheral case of Chaoxian. And then let's come to talk a little details about Xiongnu. So I would say the Han Dynasty's policy with the Xiongnu, there are 3 different stages. But nonetheless, from the very beginning, they realized that there is this kind of ecological and cultural incompatibility, so that they know they just cannot get along with the Xiongnu. So they wanted to do the military resolution from the beginning, but as the first phase, we can tell Chinese military power was no match of the Xiongnu's military power. So at the beginning, they have to try this so-called appeasement policy. It was actually very humiliating for the Han Dynasty. Just think about it. So Han Dynasty, one, they have to pay huge amount of money to beg the Xiongnu not to come back. And 2, you also heard of the marital alliance. Even though it's a marital alliance, it's actually one directional demand from the Xiongnu. So Xiongnu will demand Han Dynasty send their princess to marry their chief. And so, but later on, the Han Dynasty, they learned a little bit of tricks. So initially, they did indeed send a princess, but later on, I mean, you can imagine no princess really wanted to go, right? So they actually just, make some court ladies and then, try to disguise them as, relatives of the emperor and then send them away. So that was a very humiliating period. However, the second phase, when the Han Dynasty finally accumulated enough financial and the military resource, they decided to do this kind of military resolution. During the Emperor Wudi's time, he actually did multiple, relatively successful, military campaign against the Xiongnu. However, still it didn't fix the problem. Why? Because Xiongnu, they were the nomadic people. I mean, when they feel like they were not successful, they just run away. And then Han army, there's no way they can chase them down and then put an end of the problem. So eventually the Xiongnu problem, it was not because China was able to contain them. It's more because Xiongnu inside, among themselves, they have internal struggle. Yeah, so once the Xiongnu chief died, who will be the next chief? And then there is this kind of division as well as internal struggle, and eventually the Xiongnu, they fall apart. So this actually had helped China to deal with the Xiongnu, but nonetheless, I would say this China from the very beginning, they had a very firm policy, even though they probably sometimes need to do appeasement, but they know that there is ecological, cultural incompatibility, so military resolution, it's always the choice when it's ready to do that. There's another interesting common practice. So when China tried to write historical records, they always try to assign a Chinese ancestor for those non-Chinese people. So for the Xiongnu people, they actually assigned a Chunwei, but he was from a much early period, and then there's a huge gap in between, and after thousands of years, and now you see the Han Dynasty, there is this Xiongnu. However, for the Nanyue and the Chaoxian case, they have more recent Chinese ancestor. So for the founder of the Nanyue kingdom, the founder was Zhao Tuo. He was actually a Chinese, and it's also a local magistrate of the Han Dynasty. As for the Chaoxian, there is an early case of the Chinese immigrants. His name is Jizi. He was a Shang Dynasty aristocrat. But more recently, there is a Yan general, also considered broadly as Chinese, and Weiman, General Weiman. He came to Chaoxian and then established a new regime, Weiman Chaoxian, in China. So this is the map about the Nanyue or Southern Yue. And for Southern Yue, I would say the Han Dynasty, what they used is called assimilation policy. So because there is a Chinese ancestor over there, Han Dynasty, they actually send envoys over and over, try to negotiate with them. At the very end, there was a military clash, but that was very brief. And then China actually saved not to try to use military force until the very end. So the war ended in less than 1 year, and it's all over. This is the map of the Nanyue, and then as you can tell that, so Nanyue is at the bottom of the broad, like China, like proper, and you can tell that to the south there's Nanyue and the Han Dynasty, even though it was an empire, but it was still tiny, and there is a massive Xiongnu over there, and also there are other massive, like ethnic group to the west of China as well. So as for Korea, as I said that Korea was successful in terms of being able to maintain the so-called like a nominal submission with the virtual autonomy. And then I have two sources right there to talk about the connection. China actually made this connection to Korea. So first of all, there is a Jizi. So Jizi fled to Chaoxian and they teach their people about ritual propriety, righteousness, and the farming, as well as the horticulture. And then the other one is the Wei Man. Actually fled to China and then become the king of China. So anyway, so we are going to talk about the overall Han Dynasty policy. So we can tell that for the Xiongnu, because China from the beginning, they realized that it's impossible to cope with them. So they actually wanted to use the minimal sort of negotiation skills and then use loose ring. It's more of the containment. And then for the Nanyue, it's massive of the negotiation. And then they keep on trying to recall Zhao Tuoshi, like a Chinese lineage and the heritage. As for Korea, they did emphasize Korea had also Chinese immigrant kings, but at the same time, Korea, I think they were very successful to be able to maintain their autonomy. So as for the result of this Han policy, so Xiongnu, they indeed sustained for a long time. However, when they collapsed, they were divided, they fall apart, and the other nomadic groups, they took over the Xiongnu's land, so that today, actually, we cannot say there is even one single person can say I'm a direct descendant of the Xiongnu. So Xiongnu simply just disappeared, dissolved over the history. And the Nanyue people, over years, they lost their collective memory of being non-Chinese. And then today we know that Nanyue's land, I mean, nobody will question that they are Chinese. And then Korea become unique people because they were able to maintain their autonomy. So I think the reason I want to give a lot of emphasis about Korea is because indeed, if you look at the history of China as well as all the surrounding people, I think Korea is the unique case because there are so many possibilities Korea could be merged by Chinese. But nonetheless, Korea survived, and then as other nomadic group, they dissolved, dismissed, and disappeared. But Korea maintained their cultural heritage and the identity, and then all the way continued today. So that's something I want to emphasize about Korea. So last part, I only have 2 more minutes. I do want to emphasize that Dongyi, the Eastern Barbarian, that's the term that connected Korea and China together. So today, both Chinese and Koreans, they want to claim Dongyi. So it's very, very interesting. So before, Chinese people, they don't really like Dongyi. They feel like they were the barbarians. However, from the modern period, they want to emphasize this multiple origin of the Chinese nation. So they want to embrace like Dongyi. As for Korean, Dongyi become a new thing. So because Dongyi is widely spread out in eastern part of China, so Dongyi becomes something as it can be used as a pan-Korean irredentist imagination. So this is the map from Korean history textbook, and you can tell they use a very vague term of, let's say, the cultural index or the scope of power. And then, as you can tell, with the Dongyi or the Gojoseon, the first Korean states, and then the territorial scopes actually reached to eastern China as well as some part of today's Russia as well. And interestingly, I have to say, if before the pride about Dongyi of Koreans, it's because Confucius had a praise about Dongyi, or they want to emphasize their authenticity of the Confucian culture. Today, they want to imagine a racially homogeneous, or at least racially related, like these kind of Dongyi people, and then that can give the possibility of this massive territorial scope and cultural prosperity. This is my last slide, so I'm going to read it for you, and then that actually still, it was something I wrote in 2016, but still, even today, I think it still worked, and it still speaks deeply of my mind. So, written with a deep concern for the crisis and the tensions that resulted from difference in understanding ancient history in contemporary East Asia, this book calls for a halt to the misuse of ancient history to promote national pride and racial superiority, a practice which has only perpetuated hostility and intolerance, and assists its readers to construct a transnational history that is conducive to mutual understanding, respect, and peace building. So thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Inu Kang from Korea, Yale University. It's my great honor to be here to give a talk and share my archaeological research. As Stella talked about the Chinese history, you know that without Chinese history, we cannot study any East Asian history. But I'm an archaeologist. So we are digging up every day and accumulate many material. So I will talk about from different view about the Bronze Age. I call it just fire and ice, the formation of the Korean Bronze Age in the context of Eurasian archaeology. As mentioned by dear Professor Hwan-Soo Kim, I spent more than 30 years to study northern China and Russia, Siberia and Mongolia. So I give you some kind of different view. First of all, I want to explain you why I titled my talk that Fire and Ice. Yes, fire is bronze metallurgy. As you know, bronze, gold, iron, and glass all share the same technology. They need fire and hearth and burning. So they need to start on different technology. But from the other side, there's ice. There's the stone and jade technique. From Neolithic period, East Asia developed such the huge detail and the precise origin of the stone and jade. As you see, the left side is the Qing Dynasty pictures, and the right side is the Bronze Age of Korea. So how they coexist in Korea, that's the explanation, how we develop Korean Peninsula developed the Bronze Age. Stella just told me about how China consider their barbarians. But my question is like this. Did everything begin from Chinese civilization? When people talk about East Asia, they always think of China, Korea, and Japan. That was true after the Middle Age, like Joseon or Goryeo Dynasty. However, if we think about prehistoric time in Bronze Age, date about 3,000 years ago, the situation is quite different. Korean bronze was a completely different lineage from China. As you see, China features a series of large literal bronze, but Korea has the small-scale weapons and dagger and literal objects, such as bronze bear and mirror. We are located very near, but subtly different the tradition of bronze. So why we are so different? There is my explanation. First of all, let me show up your Korean geography. Most of your Korean will very well known about our Korean geography, but I can tell you, Korea is just only one half of California. But Korean Peninsula has from Siberia until subtropical. We are so various geographical. You see, the eastern part of Korea is a very steepy mountainous region, and South Korea is so hot. So this is the truth. Many people think Korea is very small and there's nothing in very the single culture. That's not true. Very complicated cultures. So let me explain the Korean Bronze Age. Based on the geographical diversity, I divided to three routes of Korean Bronze. Korean Bronze Age lasts for about 10 years from 13th century to 2nd century BC. The process is by no means a single formation, but there are three routes of bronze metallurgy to Korean peninsula. I will explain you in turns. The first stage is the earliest Bronze Age. It's based on the recent excavation. So far, as just Stella show up the Korean textbook, the prevailing notion within Korean archaeology is that inflow of Bronze Age originates from Old Joseon or from Manchuria, from near to China and Mongolia. Nonetheless, a paradigm shift occurred when in 2016 year, we excavate a new settlement from Gangwon province. Gangwon province located here is mountainous region. And we found from the Bronze Age dwellings, found some pieces of bronze. So this discovery strongly indicates the Korean metallurgical origin. It came from the eastern part of Korea, from mountainous region. So let's see in detail. Thoroughly, 4 pieces of bronze were discovered, which wrapped around the part of necklace made of stone beads. So the adoption of bronze is to decorate a stone necklace in a distinct manners. The similar ones, the first bronze, when we excavate, nobody knew. How can we get this bronze? But when I hear and they send me this photo, I just screamed, my God, it came from Siberia. Because, this came from Western Siberia, and that is from Baikal region, the eastern Siberia. And this came from Korea. Bronze necklace, we call it Seyma-Trubino style, found in the Siberian typical bronze style was found in Korea. So guess it, how excited I was, because I spent most of my time in Siberia and found the Siberian style bronze in Korea. And this, we call it the Seyma-Trubino phenomenon. That means the Eurasian bronze metallurgical tradition from Black Sea until the Great World War share the same bronze technique. We call it Seyma-Trubino, suggested by the theorist archaeologist Yevgeny Chernik. And recently, Chinese archaeologists also pay attention to Seyma-Trubino phenomenon as the inflow of Northern style bronze during Shang and early Zhou period. As you see, this is a new book from China, as mentioned, for example, the barbarian of Shang Dynasty, called it Guifang, they used the Northern style bronze. It came from the Siberian metallurgical tradition. So, meanwhile, this kind of Seyma-Trubino also inflows to the Korean peninsula in 2 routes, east and west. The east is earliest way, and the second way from the old Joseon route. Like this, we found that the first bronze was made by a small group of bronze craftsmen, and they produced tools and accessories that replaced such stone tools. And we analyzed that isotope analysis and show up all the earliest bronze was made in Korea. It means there was a migration of the bronze metallurgical craftsmen migrated to South Korea, to Korea. So now we can conclude that the earliest bronze was started from Korea about 3,300 years ago. Okay, the second stage is the I can say the old Joseon's route because northwestern route or Manchurian route from Korea Bronze to Korean Peninsula. We call it that is mandolin-shaped dagger or 비파형 동검 in Korea, 비파-shaped dagger. And if you are Korean, you will study this 비파-shaped dagger symbolize old Joseon's origin. Actually, you should know that archaeological view on old Joseon is not 2300 BCE as written in Dangun myth. We just think that it could be the 7th or 8th century BCE started with the rising of this developed Bronze Age culture. So we can say the pre-Old Joseon period, they started the mandolin-shaped dagger with various bronze techniques. And also, the South Korea also found some kind of this mandolin-shaped dagger, but very small amount of it. Only dagger was found in Korea, South Korea. So there's another question. Who made the mandolin-shaped daggers? I just told you that the same Trubino craftsmen migrate, but how far they reached out? There's an archaeological method. How we can trace their migration is to excavate craftsmen's tombs. So this is the Western Siberian tomb with so many mold and metallurgical tools. It came from Hebei province alongside the Great World War, and Chifeng is near to Old Joseon. How about Old Joseon? Is there some kind of these materials? Yes, I found that. I found that about 10 years ago when I went to archaeological trip to Xiongnu. I found from the Liaoyang or Liaoning some material very interesting. So there is one tomb with this mold for mandolin-shaped daggers and this mold for axes. You see the two faces on this mold. It was found from tombs. So migration of semi-trubinous craftsmen reached out to Old Joseon. So this evidence this can be seen in these tombs, Tawanchun, Liaoning area. And it dates to about the 5th century BCE. You see the earliest phase of Old Joseon, and you see the concrete evidence of craftsmen carved. They probably carved ancestor of the craftsmen. It was used for the bronze metallurgical rituals, smelting ritual like that. So I also excavated the similar image of these faces from the mold. Yeah, surely we found from the Neimanggu until the river of Songha. Yeah, it's kind of the belt for metallurgical migration. So this route is very strong, suggests that Korean Old Joseon bronze came not from China, but from Northern Territory. But in other hand, there is no any evidence in South Korea. In South Korea's face, it's from the petroglyph from Bangude, is thoroughly different. So there is another explanation why South Korean face are so different. So there was no such a strong migration to South Korea. So I think this is the encounter of Eurasian bronze with South Korean of a tradition. That means dolmen society and rice cultivating culture. So dolmen society with a polished stone dagger, as you see, they mixed together with this kind of bronze pipa-shaped daggers, and how they managed to coexistence. It's very interesting because when the mandolin-shaped dagger influenced South Korea was flourished by rice farming, dolmen, and like this rice. Excuse me. Like this, the fortified villages, rice paddy, and dolmens. but there was no any bronze metallurgical economy. So Korean dolmen society adopted mandolin-shaped daggers, but in a small amount. As you see, just mandolin-shaped dagger without anything. And this, many people believe that bronzeware is more valuable than stone. But in South Korea's dolmen society, it's not true. Owning bronzeware does not mean a superior status. Only a very small number of mandolin-shaped bronze daggers were used. They were reformed and reused to replace the stone dagger. This is another mandolin-shaped dagger from South Korea, just one half of the daggers. And I saw the grind traces are very similar to stone dagger. It means that reuse of mandolin-shaped dagger alongside stone dagger found just replace the stone daggers. So a bronze dagger is not so high status. They just played a very small role in the Korean society. Then question, why reshape the bronze dagger? Sometimes we found this kind of the bronze dagger. They ground it like this form to fit this kind of stone dagger. In spite of adoption bronze weapon, the stone dagger remained the mainstream, and bronze dagger were reshaped to fit the scabbard of the stone dagger. So they ground them, and they used like the stone polished dagger. Another evidence is the dolmen. Stone dagger predominance also seen in the dolmens. Why did dolmens? You see, there are two men, one sitting, one is standing, and worship the stone dagger. They was carved on the dolmen from Jeollanam-do. Why did dolmen society hesitate to adopt advanced bronze technology from old Joseon? I think there was a great ideological resistance, fearing that privileged status of stone dagger possession would disappear. I mean that the technology, stone craftsmen's predominance. So they want to maintain the existing power. So dolmen society still worship stone polished dagger like this kind of rock carving. And the situation has changed from 4th century BC. As Stella mentioned, that there was so many things. The Wayman appeared, and the Great World War. Also, Korea has changed hegemony shift to adopt fully developed bronze culture from old Joseon. Major change occurred in the Korean bronze in this time, and the developed bronze from North Korea, Manchuria, moved south fully. Simultaneously, the very important things happened in Korea. Dolmen disappeared from this period. The dissolution of the dolmen hegemony and the emergence of a new power usually started like this. From this time, various bronzeware has started. The widespread of expansion of old Joseon bronzeware was accompanied by shaman ritual tools such as bells and many these ritual bronzes. At the same time, the construction of dolmen stopped. I mean, there's a new culture based on the bronze technology of Go-Joseon has started. So if you think about these whole changes, it means that they concern the dynamic political cultural change in the 4th century BC. As you see, at the time, Yan expanded and nomadic people also integrated to Xiongnu, and old Joseon had diminished. All these political change also concerned to Korea, and sometimes some nomadic peoples bronze also went to Japanese archipelago. So this also concerned with the nomadic peoples Xiongnu. Stella just mentioned about the Xiongnu and Nanyue Chaoxian Joseon as part of the barbarian of the China. For archaeology, there's a little bit different view. They connected connected constant in each other. Okay, and so this is the older style or nomad style daggers from Japan, and you can see compare that. Anyway, from the dissolution of the dolmen, emergence of priest of agriculture had appeared. Like you see, this kind of this means that dolmen is a result of community. But from this time, power was concentrated on individuals. So it means the political changes. So from this Korean bronze start a new stage. I think that just Stella told that Koreanese. I could also say Koreanization of Korean bronze. It means fine line molten of the bronze mirror. How to say in English, it's very difficult to pronounce. But anyway, 단유생 운경. In Korea, this kind of bronze mirror is adopted from old Joseon, and they developed such a fine, so unprevious my masterpiece of bronze has appeared in South Korea. This kind of the advanced metallurgical technology is very awesome because the fine line bronze mirror that came to Korea developed into a more sophisticated technology. This elaborate pattern is on the back and cannot be seen from the outside because it's hung on the clothing. The reason for the elaborate pattern on this back is that it was thought that bronze technology has the power to communicate with God. So this is an example. On the one mirror, there is a 13,000 circle and zigzag made in 1.2 millimeter lines. I think that's the most precise bronze in the world, I think. It's very small, but precise. So yes, I think that's very similar to semiconductor wafer. So yes, I'm kidding. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to one conclusion. What's the features of Korean bronze? First is coexistence of stone and bronze dagger. Koreanized bronze item was, fine line mirrors and daggers were subsequently developed with the introduction of bronze item from old Joseon. The Korean Bronze Age was characterized by the coexistence of stone and bronze implement rather than replacements of stone with bronze. So this was the coexistence of fire and ice. And this would be very special for Korea. And so this is what different from Chinese bronze. As you see, from the development of Korean bronze developed two small but elaborate and precise one. As you see, if this is a Japanese dodaku, it became bigger and bigger. As you see, Vietnam, Dongsan Muna, Dongsan culture, bronze drum, also is very big. And yes, this is a Chinese ritual. All the East Asian bronze became bigger and bigger, but not in Korea. Korean tradition is just concentrate on shaman. And the small but elaborate bronze was made. So like this, my opinion is that the Korean bronze is multi-layered from Eurasia and about third stage. So I want to tell you about the long-time myth about the Korean people. The myth of single race theory for Korea was predominated in 20th century Korean society, but it does not match actual archaeological data. Development of Korean ancient culture was multi-layered. So if term Koreanization is possible, it began from the Bronze Age and was completed with the establishment of Three Kingdom period. And this is after the Bronze Age. Transition to the Three Kingdom period. It's very interesting that the limited development of bronzeware paradoxically enabled accelerate ironware production from the 2nd century BC to Three Kingdom period. You see the Gaya kingdom's armor and Shilla's gold crown. And Shilla's gold crown was decorated with stone, jade crafting. like this. Despite the development of iron stoneworking, technique continues of Stone Age crafting. So I think how they coexist, the bronze technology from Eurasia with the jade and stone production in Korea. How they harmonized. That is the first step of the Koreanized Bronze Age culture, and it continued to the formation of the Three Kingdom period. So to understand Korean Bronze Age in the context of Eurasia would be the first step to re-examine the origin of Korean people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for really stimulating talk.
It has always been very hard to link the material culture with the ethnic groups. So how do you, there could be multiple type of different interpretations. There the scholars will argue. And with your special training of archaeology in Russia, do you think you are the so-called mainstream of the Korean archaeologists, or what's your opinion different or aligned with other scholars?
Oh yeah, mainstream is my heartache problem because I was the first person to study from the Siberia. So when I start my career, I was minority. And it's very interesting. Most of Korean archaeologists blame me that I study something that's difficult. But now, so many archaeologists are interested in Korea. For example, in last year, the Korean forum, archaeological forum was titled Korean Archaeology Outside Korea. Oh, so it have changed. We want to take consideration of Korean archaeology in the context of world history just started. But, the most difficult problem is North Korea. We cannot visit there. So every time, South Korea is part of the Eurasian continent. But in real life, we feel like we live in the island. We cannot go there. And furthermore, to research the northern regions, neighbor region, we should learn not less than 4 languages: Russian, Chinese, and Mongolian too. So that's problem. But step by step, we extend our view of archaeology. So South Korea is not a single word. We try to make more international view.
Now, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting talk about the Chaoxian, the Joseon and Xiongnu. And my question is very like this. As we know, Xiongnu and Weiman Joseon, they locate very not far, and some in Chinese resource there was remember that ancient Joseon or Chaoxian is the left arm of the Xiongnu. How about the relationship between barbarians? And is there any some Chinese policy also influenced on their relationship?
That's a wonderful question. So that's also a very complicated question, and I will try to give my simplest answer for that. So on the one hand, yes, there is a connection between Chaoxian versus the Xiongnu. So location-wise, Xiongnu was in the northern part of China, and Chaoxian was in northeastern part of China. They probably had some kind of communication and the contact. We just do not have too much of information about that. So, but in addition to the information that Professor Gang just mentioned, that there's a common sense of the Chaoxian was the one arm of the Xiongnu. That means that they could have alliance and they could work together. But on the other hand, there's another very interesting sort of historical records about that Weiman. So when Weiman fled to Korea, actually, his supervisor, Lu Wan, he fled to Xiongnu. So, and then, like if his supervisor fled to Xiongnu and he fled to Chaoxian, is there any connection? Is there any reason for that? We do not yet know. I'm just hoping that one, we will get more of the archaeological data to make some connection. And two, altogether, like I said in my last slide, I want history to be a more of like a transnational, interregional, that type of history. And instead of giving emphasis of one particular ethnic group or one particular region, we really have to look at history in a broader like time span, or also in much broader like a geographical scope as well. So anyway. So from Han's perspective, but it's interesting that from very beginning, they realized that Xiongnu, they have a different economy, right? They are nomads, and then they just realized that they cannot tame Xiongnu, and then it's better to think of some kind of once for all, that kind of resolution, that's the military. As for Korea, from the beginning, that not only they have like a sage immigrate to Chaoxian, but also as for the economy, it's similar, right? It's all about farming, and it's about those kind of things. They actually, from China's perspective, I do feel like they feel more of the affinity, closeness, if you really want to compare Chaoxian versus Xiongnu. That would be a huge difference.
Okay, if you don't have any further questions, let's open the floor. Any questions, thoughts? I see big, your hand is about to go up. No. Big? Is it me? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sure. So I had a question for Professor Xu. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm wondering if you can talk about just the challenges, the struggles of using China's imperial sources to do this kind of history. That I'm all in favor of this vision of history as you laid it out, but we're sort of trapped in the ideology of a particular tradition. How do we use these sources productively to get beyond the sources?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And that's also the question I've been struggling for a long time. So we all know that as historians, we want primary source, right? So whenever, at least if there is a primary source, that would be great. However, we always need to have a critical eyes of those primary source. So for Chinese sources, it's a big like a dilemma, right? On the one hand, there is no other sources in other language, so you have to use Chinese sources. At the same time, of course, Chinese sources, all the historians, they have their own bias. They have their own reason to write something and disregard or intentionally omit something as well. So, I don't have a good or easy solution for that. I'm just, when I do research, I just keep on telling myself that one, I have to think about why and how, that kind of question in regard those kind of primary sources. And two, if there is any way to find any, we don't have historical records in other language, but at least if we have any sort of material, like archaeological data that can sort of back up or cross-check of those resources. So, and again, in the future, that's the dilemma of the Chinese sources. On the one hand, it's great to have them, but on the other hand, because there's no other sources, and then you just need to deal with their bias and also problems as well. So, thank you.
We should think of more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, thank you, Professor Kang, for your wonderful presentation. I just have a question about when do we see the earliest clay molds in Korea?
Clay mold.
Because sorry to interrupt, but most of what you discussed the objects you discussed are made with stone molds. But I just want to know when the first clay molds are. I know in Japan it's the late Yayoi period, but thank you.
Yeah, the clay mold is very controversial because so far there was no any such example from South Korea. But as for me, I found the clay mold from the far eastern region of Russia. It's located near the Hamgyeongbukdo, the northeastern part of the Korea. But that clay mold was made for the bronze button. It's the first stage for my presentation. So I probably they should use the clay mold about 3,000 years ago for small pieces of the ornament. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for these wonderful talks. I have a question also for Professor Khan regarding the mirrors and all of the incised lines and the style. You mentioned that we also find that on stone, but do we also find that on other materials, particularly such as pottery? And what might that say perhaps more about its function? And also, we find these mirrors all over Japan as well. So do we also find those incised lines in those mirrors in Japan, and what might that also say about this kind of transnational contact? I'd be really curious. Thank you.
Yes, transnational relationship is my own interest, but pottery doesn't show that kind of the long distance interaction because pottery making is just for the small community. For example, the first, I just deleted some slides because the Professor Hans Kim asked me to keep on the time. But the first bronze from the Gangwon-do, there's the same one, also pottery, also found from the Yanbian, Chaoxian, how to speak, the northeastern part of the China. So I think when they migrate, they also share the similar type of the pottery. But the long distance and transnational for the transnational relationship, pottery is not so good thing. But another one is the jade. And I just also deleted, but a very interesting case is why the same true in the bronze craftsmen migrate. They exchanged, and the jade craftsmen also migrate to west. So that kind of the prestige group is the good example for the transnational cases. Also, if you talk about the Southeastern Asia, I just talk about the Eurasia, but from the south, they may analyze the glasses and beads, also the kind of transnational relationship.
John first, and then
Spencer. Thank you for these two fascinating talks. My question is for Professor Inu Kang about shamanism and the priests that you indicated on the one bronze piece. You did say that you attributed the emphasis on smaller and more elaborate bronze wares in Korea to shamanism. But I'm curious why exactly you make that attribution. What do you think it is about shamanism that makes Korea at that time need or desire smaller, more elaborate pieces, and what is absent from Korea? What factors are making their neighbors want larger, less elaborate pieces that are absent in Korea, and is that the result of shamanism? But also about that bronze artifact item it's a very famously shown one, of course, and I've seen it many times, and I've always seen it just saying like, oh, this is a farmer. So this speaks to the importance of agriculture, but you said it's an agricultural priest. So I'm curious about your identification. Is that your identification? Is it coming from somewhere else? And is that a shamanic figure? You did say it has to do with, it's a priest, but it's also indicating the concentration of political power individuals. So how does that all kind of connect together with your shamanism theory?
Okay, first question, why Korean bronze became smaller and smaller? Yeah, that's a very good question. That means I still I'm looking for the explanation. But my explanation is, so far, is the absence of tin mining. There's no any ancient tin mining in Korea. Yeah, but as I told you, I've never been in North Korea. But anyway, in South Korea, there's no any ancient mining. So every bronze needs a long distance importing of tin. Maybe from China, maybe from Southeast China. So it costs very much higher. So shaman decide to make much smaller but precise. That's my hypothesis for this, why the Korea became smaller and smaller. And the second, why I thought that the farmer is priest. I just skipped very quickly, but that the farmer had a long cockpit head like the American, the natives chief. And there are so many other features show up that there is not the plain farming. It is kind of the ritual. In the bronze, there was carved for 4 seasons. And so it means that all the whole circle of the farming, and they really worship the harvest from the shamanism. And lastly, the shamanism, how concerned with the contemporary shaman, also it's very interesting, and I have no idea, but anyway, we are still looking for that reason. These small shaman ritual, like the bronze bell and symbol, still share with the contemporary Korean shamanism. So I think shamanism root should be deeper than we think.
Thank you so much for your talks. And I was wondering if Professor Xu might talk a little bit more about, from the perspective of Han era historiographer, what might make a particular people civilizable as differentiated from other less civilizable peoples. You mentioned over the course of your talk and your first question, two different potential groups of things, susceptibility to ritual and ability to take on ritual practice, as well as agriculture, seeming civilizable, and potentially from the eyes of a Han writer. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about any interplay you might see between these two criteria or other criteria for what might make a group of people amenable to taking on the attributes of civilization, from as seen from the center that was Han China at this point in time.
Thank you. That's such a complicated question. And so I would say that, first of all, I think it's a common practice that the Han historian, regardless it's true or not, and they always try to assign Chinese ancestor. Like I said, even the Xiongnu, they don't really like Xiongnu, but nonetheless, they assign a Xiongnu, a Chinese ancestor from the Xia Dynasty period, which is from a much earlier period. But by doing that, because there's a huge gap in between, and they're basically saying that, even though they had a Chinese ancestor before, in the middle, they lost the contact with China, and then they went their nomadic way so that it's too hard for them to, come back to this kind of civilizational, that kind of like a past. So that's their argument. As for if we just want to compare with Chaoxian versus Nanyue, they have a more recent the ancestor that they assigned for Korea as well as for the Nanyue. So that's one thing. And two, yes, ecology and also farming, that's a big thing of that. And from China's perspective, that the Xiongnu ecology, Xiongnu economy, it's just unthinkable. If you look at the historical records, they have a lot of criticism of their lifestyle. And so that will make a huge difference as well. So, so this is Chinese like a theory. So if you send someone as a messenger of civilization and teach people of, agricultural, horticulture, all these kind of things, and the people there are very receptive, and then they learned, and then they do well, and then from Chinese perspective, that's the civilizable like barbarians. As for Xiongnu, because the culture is so different, and also in Shiji, there are actually quite a few things, the historical records that from China's like moral standard, it's unthinkable. For example, it says that the Xiongnu people, they save their best food for the young people because they have to have war constantly, and then they save food for the young people because they have to go fight, and then to have this kind of to protect the group interest. But they don't give food unless they have far more than enough. They don't give food to the old people because they feel like they are useless. That's totally too contradictory with the Confucian value, right? Another thing is that from Chinese records, it says that the Xiongnu, when their father died, the oldest son can marry to their stepmother. That's incest from Chinese perspective, right? That's unthinkable. And also, if the older brother died, the younger brother could and should marry to the sister-in-law. And then there's a good reason for that because they don't want to divide their property and they want to move around together. However, altogether, these kind of practice from Chinese perspective, it's just unthinkable. It's just too much to make the gap. So, and on the other hand, I also feel like the nomads, their military power, they are too intimidating from Chinese perspective. So that, of course, we are talking about the value of the primary sources. Yes, they have added all these bias and those negative, sentiment into those documents. So we also, again, need to be very careful when we read them. So that's how China or Chinese historians from that time try to understand who is civilizable, who is not.
Can I add something about her talk? Yeah. Actually, this is my destiny. When I'm in Korea, I give a talk about Xiongnu, Hunnu archaeology. And when I go abroad, I give a talk about Korean archaeology. So yeah, that's my job, destiny. Anyway, the historical document in Shuji has very many contradictions with archaeological record. For example, recent 2 years ago, Mongolian archaeologists found excavate a very big fortress. They found Chinese hieroglyphs on the roof tile. It dates about 3rd century BCE, until Sinicized writing. Xiongnu knew Chinese hieroglyph. They made use of that, but they didn't adopt for their daily life because they are nomad people. So why when father died, why they married to stepmother? That's the nomadic life. In nomadic people, they cannot live on by the widows. So they should gather together to survive like this. Everything, and furthermore, I just mentioned questions to Stella that how about the relationship between Xiongnu and Joseon? Because when we excavate in Xiongnu, there are just so many fortresses, and they found ondol. Do you know ondol? The Korean floor heating system, also found in Hunnu settlement. So I think the archaeology shows that Simachian fully know about the real life of the Hunnu.
Yeah, that actually starts to answer the question I was going to ask, which is these two talks juxtaposed next to each other make me think that Kija was a shaman, which obviously by Han discourses, Joseon is supposed to be the most sinicized of the neighboring kingdoms. But the archaeological evidence points in the opposite direction. So in some ways, I'd like to put these papers in dialogue and ask Professor Xu to reflect a little bit on the centrality of material culture to Chinese ritual order, which in many ways it is. And then the archaeological evidence that, as you just noted, points out that the Xiongnu are in fact more sinicized than Korea. And then how far that archaeological evidence pushes against these Han period discourses. Do we get to the Baikal region? Do we get far out into the Ordos and unexpected places?
Can you summarize in Korean? I just missed something.
The question is to reflect on how far sort of Sinitic archaeological discoveries extend out into the regions that someone like Sima Qian said that these guys are unforgivable barbarians. So how far into Mongolia, Russia, like Lake Baikal, do we see Sinitic civilization in the archaeological record, as opposed to in Korea, where we would expect to find it? We don't see it very clearly based on the presentation.
So can you?
So your question, how far we can find this kind of Sinitic influence in beyond China?
Yeah, beyond into Inter-Asia, sort of.
Like Kazakhstan and Mongolia.
Finish
중국을 넘어서 어느 정도까지 그 중국에 영향을 미쳤는지.
The Sinitic relationship. They reached out until the Crimea Peninsula and the Black Sea region. And they were found. They lived the Sarmatian. Sarmatian is the part of the Scythian. They were found the Han period mirrors and Han lacquers were found Scythian tombs. So far as I know, the Black Sea and Crimea Peninsula, and that's all. And recently, they also found some kind of another things in the center of Ukraine. But we probably think that could be just imported, not from China, from the another region, from Crimea Peninsula.
Just to add a little bit, I feel like, the recent archaeological data, it's more of I would say, it's a supplementary kind of materials to understand the written records we have. And you are right that it definitely presented some kind of contradictory information about that. But still, I think Korea, because of this affinity with China, definitely Korea get far more cultural influence from China. So Korea was definitely far more sinicized in that sense. As for the Xiongnu or the area further, maybe previously by only reading the records, we just feel like, oh, maybe their Chinese culture didn't go that far. They lived totally opposite to the Chinese culture. And then the recent materials just help to back up. I mean, like it's just to give a sort of a different opinion. But I think it's still not sufficient enough to argue that which direction goes to more sinicized way. So
all the questions have come from that side, like the Han Empire. This is a periphery. Is there any question? Okay, here we go.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talks. So my question has to do with the idea of like both of you spoke very candidly about the opportunities involved in kind of a multinational, larger, broader view of looking at history beyond borders, beyond ethnicities, and trying to bring those those shared moments together to find more accurate and full pictures of history. But one thing that we've often seen in a lot of historical related professions, including archives, which is where I work in, is that as we look at these kind of shared international models of history, we often run into issues of custody when it comes to the cultural heritage and materials themselves. And so I'm wondering, in both of your experiences, how does this kind of looking across borders and different boundaries of ethnicity and race and nation kind of lead into the kind of complicate these ethical quandaries around the custody of these cultural heritage objects?
I think that it's a very good question and complicated. Why I love my job, archaeology, there was no any political borders in ancient time, and they show up the very many things that we cannot see. Furthermore, the historical document also has own restriction. Sima Qian has his own point of view. So I can see it clearly, but as for me, my own experience is Balhae or Bohai. There are just a very big, serious conflict with China, and we both claim that is one part of the Korean national history, and also China also too. Each kind of the part of the China, and there is another nation, Russia, because some part of the Balhae is located in the Russian Far East. Also, they claim who owned the Balhae history is a very big problem still. But my question is very simple: who knows that? And Balhae and is multi-layered. Who can if when we invent the DNA analysis, many archaeologists hope that we can define who is the ethnicity. But the result is not so paradoxically very complicated. So I think the cultural heritage and the debating is still going on. But now we are the political. Another thing is from the Russian and Ukraine war, and the Syrian gold also share the same experience. So I think the most problem is that recent politician wants to make propaganda from the cultural heritage. It's the biggest problem for us.
I agree with all you have just said, and that's the real problem. And I myself encountered those problems. I'm sure it's still happening a lot. But I personally want to be a little more optimistic, because even for the past 20 years, things have changed a lot in positive ways. So altogether, I mean, there may be small setbacks, but altogether, I want to be a little more optimistic for the future. And as the reason for me to write my books, it's about the critical analysis of the views of ancient history. So the reason for me to write that is because I definitely had realized that for a little while, for the Chinese-Japanese Japanese Korean historians, when they write about history, it's more of they are trying to lay claims of their heritage, and then they want to say whatever they have is the oldest or the best or the unique, and it's that kind of direction. So the reason I feel myself is lucky in that I reside here, and then I write for the audience here, and hopefully that the readers in China, Japan, Korea, I hope they read my book as well. But altogether, my hope is that in the long run, I'm hoping that altogether we have this common sense of trying to make a human history, transnational history, and much less about trying to make a claim of racial, national superiority over other countries. And there's some kind of a good development lately. I know, like, even though Japan and Korea, they disagree a lot. I mean, they have this common textbook writing committee. And however, as China, Japan, Korea, there is a very, very interesting dynamic of two alliance. So when they talk about ancient history, Japan and Korea, they are easy to ally together because both of them, they are in the position to argue that they have their own national history, and then the Chinese influence can be as late as possible, and then they developed to their own national way. So for the ancient part, Japan and Korea can be easy allies. As for the modern history, we all know that China and Korea, they can be easy allies because they were both victim of Japanese the imperialism and war crimes. So there is a very interesting dynamics over there. But altogether, I'm trying to be more optimistic in the future. And then these kind of venue, this is very, very helpful. And then I myself are trying to keep a distance with the sort of argument or controversy in East Asia, and then try to think of things in a more like neutral way.
If I can say something more, another problem in East Asia is the grant system. If in South Korea, if we don't talk about nationalism or it's China also, and if we don't say about our great history, it's very difficult to get some grant, like another nation. So I just told you that political propaganda makes it more complicated. But the hope is from the young generation. Young generation doesn't get interest about their great history. They just want to know the open mind. So I think that the time needed, but I think the future will be better.
Yeah, I think like your question is a really ongoing issue and dilemma between this decentering and the centering and labeling and unlabeling and all this. It's really hard to strike the balance. I think it's the kind of ongoing issue. I think you have a question?
Professor Xu, and I have to excuse myself, so if someone's already asked this question, you can tell me later, but your answer. But with your emphasis on Han Dynasty sources, I was wondering, where do you place the 4 Han commanderies? And that were established in 108 BCE and continued more or less into the early 4th century CE.
Yes. So I recently wrote, I was invited to write an introduction to a collective work, and it was from a British publisher, and then they are trying to collecting the missionaries writing about Korean history. So, from 1890s, there are missionaries from United States, from other countries, they went to Korea, and they lived in Korea, and then they start to write about Korean history, cultural, and then, so this British company, they want to collect some of their writings of 100 years ago, and then how they think of Korean history, Korean people, and the Korean culture. I wrote the introduction for that part. And then I list a series of questions or the most controversial issues there. And of course, the Han Commandery, it's one of the most, the highly, hotly debated one. And in addition to Han Commandery, there is like a Mimana issues, and then there's still a chronology of like Dangun Joseon, Giza Joseon, and Women Joseon, who is more important, who represent more of the Korean culture, and all these kind of things. Yes, Han commentary, I mean, we still, so there are sources there. It's better, maybe better than some other like controversial issues. However, we still do not have enough sources of that. And then as from the thing I have so far and from my understanding, I still feel like Han commentaries, 4 of them, they were located in part of today's Northeast China and also most part of Northern Korea as well. And too bad that, like Professor Gang says, that we just cannot go to North Korea right now. And yeah, so when I did my research, I tried to read a lot of like North Korean scholars writing about their history. And then this is a recommendation. If you are ever interested in how North Koreans understand their history, you should go to the Library of Congress. You will be too surprised. Before, I didn't believe it. I believe it only after I get there. There is a tremendous amount of North Korean books and journals, magazines, those kind of things in the Library of Congress. That will really help you to understand how North Koreans developed their understanding of Korean history. Yes, there is a Han commentary there. Definitely, I would say both North Korean and South Korean scholars, most of them, they don't like it. They don't want to talk about that. And then in the history textbook, there's only like a sort of minimal things. Even with the minimal things, they still want to emphasize more of the Korean resistance. So one of the most recent textbook, when they talk about the Han commentary, they didn't mention about Han commentary, but they, at the same time, they quickly said that Korean people rallied like a resistance against the Han commentary, and so that they couldn't last very long in Korea. So that was the thing. So yeah, we have to rely more on for the archaeological data, but I believe that Han commentary definitely had existed, and then definitely it's part of today's Northern Korea and part of Northeast China as well. It's not like some Korean scholars had argued that Han commentary is totally outside of Korea and totally irrelated to today's Korean history. So there is that kind of extreme argument, but I think that's been going too far.
Okay, I think we are at time. I think our conversation will continue. This was round 1. Hopefully to have another one, round 2, sometime soon. Thank you so much. Please give them a big round of applause.
Thank you.
And we cannot talk about identity without having Korean food outside, and we can continue our conversation. Thank you so much.